Hello, I'm See Eun from We Learn to Share, and welcome to the Comparative Linguistics course. Throughout this course, I'm going to teach you comparative linguistics through various examples, and in the first few lessons, we're going to focus on actually understanding what it means to do comparative linguistics and what linguistics is in general. So in today's lesson, we are going to learn the basic terminology with some examples so that you won't be completely lost when we actually start doing the complicated stuff. So let's get started. What is linguistics? Well, linguistics is not language learning. It's a common misconception that people think that a linguist is a polyglot, a person who speaks multiple languages, but that's not necessarily true because linguistics is the scientific study of languages. Linguists do not learn language to acquire them, they study languages. So although linguistics may certainly help in language learning, it doesn't necessarily mean that they all speak multiple languages. And linguistics can be splitted into two categories. The first one being general linguistics and the second one being applied linguistics. General linguistics include subjects such as syntax, the study of the structure of languages, morphology, the words, the phonology, the sounds, and historical linguistics, part of linguistics to which comparative linguistics belongs. For applied linguistics, well, since linguistics can be applied in so many different areas, some of them might feel obscure and might even look like linguistics. And we are not going to look at applied linguistics in this course. So some examples include sociolinguistics, cognitive linguistics, and then etc., etc. So comparative linguistics, I just said, belongs to historical or diachronic linguistics. And it's based on the methodology called the comparative method. To summarize, what you do is you compare different languages that you think are from a common source. Then we call this genetic relationship. You look if they actually come from the same language. Then, if you can confirm that they descend from a common ancestor, you try to reconstruct that common ancestor. And the reason why we call it reconstruct is because these common ancestors, what we call proto-languages, are not attested, which means we don't have any record about them. So we have to reconstruct and make very reasonable guesses. And they are very reasonable, they're very reliable, quite accurate. Still, they are guesses. We lack of physical evidences, so you always have to keep that in mind. Here are some examples of comparative method. So the first step of the comparative method is preparing a set of cognates. The cognates are words that genetically share a common ancestor. For example, so here we have three words from the Germanic language family: Old English, Water, Old Norse, Warten, Old High German, Wasser, and obviously they all mean water. So through very complicated processes that I can't really explain right now, we can deduce that they all come from the same language, which we call Proto-Germanic and quite commonly abbreviated as PGMC. And these three words descend from the Proto-Germanic word wator. Well, we can actually go further and include more languages because the Germanic language family belongs to a larger language family called the Indo-European language family. So we can include Latin, unda, which means wave, and also ancient Greek, hudor, and Old East Slavic, voda, both meaning water. And by comparing these languages and many more, we can figure out that they all come from Proto-Indo-European. As you can infer from the name Indo-European, it also includes the Indo-Aryan languages like Hindi or Persian as well. This is the actual family tree of the Indo-European language family. If you go to the bottom left, you can find Germanic, then West, Anglo-Frisian, and Old English, and finally the English that we know. So let's learn the actual terminology. Cognate, well, I've explained this already, is a word that genetically shares a common ancestor. So you could say that English, know, and Latin, cognosco, are cognates, and you could also include more words like ancient Greek, gignosco. However, a loan word is a word that is borrowed, not inherited from another language. So the Korean word for bread, bang, is a loan word from the Japanese word, which is then from Portuguese. A phoneme is the basic unit of sound, and we are actually going to talk about this later. Morpheme is the smallest unit in a word that has a meaning. So the prefix un in the word unhappy is a morpheme because it's got a meaning. It means not. But un in understand is quite not a morpheme because it doesn't have a meaning on its own. It's just part of a prefix under. So you could say under is a morpheme, stand is a morpheme, but un is not a morpheme in this case. And finally, sound changes. Sound changes are the essentials of comparative linguistics. So languages change over time, and that's a fact. We just know it. And I'm not just talking about centuries of time, millennia of time, but I'm talking about years, decades, or even months. And these changes come in very different forms. It could be sound changes, could be changes in grammar, spelling, many more. But we are going to look at the sound changes in general. And what's so fascinating about languages is that changes in sound are not irregular. They follow a set of rules, and when they do not, you can explain why they might be considered irregular. Why? Then you can explain why they look irregular, but technically they are not. And since we are going to talk a lot about these kinds of sound changes, we need to be able to simplify them with symbols. So the greater than symbol here means A changed to B. The sound A changed to the sound B. And similarly, lesser than means A comes from B. And some sound changes are conditional. They only happen in a specific condition in an environment. And in that case, the condition is written after a forward slash. So if you look at the last line, it says A changed to B, then forward slash, capital V underscore capital V. The underscore represents the position of the sound that we're talking about. So in this case, it'd be A. Capital V, well, in comparative linguistics, generally means any vowel, an unspecified vowel. So this rule means A changed to B between vowels, or A changed to B intervocalically. And let's look at some more examples. So the first one, well, the underscore is just there. It means A changed to B in any case, in every case. So technically, you could just leave it out. The next example, the hashtag refers to a word boundary, so the either ends of a word. And since the underscore is next to it, it means it's the word. Well, the start of the word, the beginning of the word. So this rule means A change to B in the beginning of a word, or word initially. The next one, the $sign means kind of similar to hashtag, but it means a syllable boundary, so the either ends of a syllable. And since the underscore is before it, it must mean the end of a syllable. Therefore, this rule means A change to B at the end of a syllable. The next one, there's a symbol that looks like colon, but it's actually not. It means that you pronounce the preceding sound longer. And like capital V, capital C means any consonant, so this rule means any vowel changed to a longer version, so a corresponding long vowel before any consonant. Finally, the last example. Well, this is an actual real rule. It's called Bucola's rule, and it happened in a process from Proto-Indo-European to Classical Greek. And it just means that some sets of sounds, which are called bilabial velar stops, changed to regular velar stops next to the vowel U. And notice the asterisk signs before each PIE phoneme. This means that the following, whatever it is, like it could be a word, morpheme, sound, is a reconstruction. So it's never tested. International phonetic alphabet is crucial in any part of linguistics. It was made to represent every single sound in the world without ambiguity, and that's very important because when you say, for example, the English A sound, we're not sure which English A sound you're referring to. Like it could be R, it could be A, it could be A. But when you use the IPA, you wouldn't have those kinds of ambiguity. So for example, the symbol T represents a voiceless alveolar plosive or a voiceless alveolar stop. And English T sound is a kind of a voiceless alveolar plosive. So, well, the name of it may sound very complicated, but if you divide it into different sections, it's not really. For example, voiceless means that your vocal cords don't vibrate. So when you pronounce t, while your fingers are on your neck, you don't really feel anything. As opposed to when you pronounce the, you can actually feel the vibration. The second part, alveolar, refers to the position of the tongue so that the tongue is touching the alveolus. And it's a part right behind your upper teeth. So when you pronounce t, you can feel it. Plosive or stop refers to the type of articulation, the way in which you make the sound, and I'm actually going to explain all the different types of articulation in the next slide with the actual IPA consonant chart. Now this chart shows most of the consonants, but it doesn't show the non-pulmonic consonants, those which do not use the air from your lungs. So the first column is a list of all the types of articulation. So plosive, or stop, is when you first block the flow of air, then suddenly release it, like t or p, k, d. Nasal is when you use your nose, obviously. So when you try to pronounce while you're blocking your nose, you can feel the pressure building up until you can't really pronounce it anymore. That is because in order to pronounce a nasal, the air needs to exit through the nasal cavity, but since you're blocking it, well, the air has no way to go out. Trill is quite literally a trill, like the Spanish R sound, alveolar trill, ra, or the bilabial trill, when you mimic a sound of a car engine, bra, or the French R sound, a uvular trill, ra. A tap or a flap is kind of like a single version of trill, like alveolar trill is ra, but alveolar tap is ra. Fricative is when you're when there's a gap between the tongue and whatever part of mouth that the articulation is happening, so that it doesn't really block the flow of the air, but it only interrupts it. So like when you pronounce the S and then pronounce the T, you can feel the tongue staying at the same position. But when you pronounce the S, there's a gap so that the air goes through it. And the velar fricative is the famous German CH sound, like ch. The uvular fricative is the Scottish CH sound, like in the word loch. An approximant is when the tongue is further than a fricative. So like alveolar approximant, or usually post-alveolar approximant, is the English R sound, ra. And palatal approximant, very common, is the Y sound in English, or the Y sound. Lateral approximant is, well, it's quite complicated. So when you pronounce the L, your tongue, the tip of your tongue is touching the alveolus, but the air can still go around it, hence the name lateral. Lateral fricative is just a strong version of it, so l. Obviously, if there's consonants, there's vowels as well. For example, the I symbol represents a high front unrounded vowel. It's pronounced E. High front, it could also be called close front, refers to the position of the tongue. So when you pronounce E, then pronounce A, you can feel the difference in either the wideness of your mouth or the height of your tongue. Unrounded refers to how rounded your lips are. So when you pronounce oo or o, you can feel your lips rounding, whereas when you pronounce e or or ah, they don't. So here is the vowel chart. Again, each position represents the position of your tongue. When you actually pronounce E, then gradually change to A, you can feel your tongue going down or your mouth opening up, like yeah. So, yep, that's it for the vowels. And quite unfortunately, these symbols aren't really enough. So the IPA has more extra diacritics. And we're only going to learn a few of them, mostly these four. So aspiration mark, the H, the little H, it means that you add more breath to it. So the Spanish T sound is ta, but the English T sound is aspirated, so it's ta, ta. There's more breath into it. Labialized means that your lips are closed, so that it kind of sounds like the W sound. So compare quake and cake. Palatalized means your tongue is closer to the palate, so it kind of sounds like the palatal approximant, the Y sound. So when you say fuse, fuse, instead of fuse. And the last one, we've already looked at it. It means you pronounce the preceding sound longer. So when you say more, you say more instead of more. So these are the different types of sound changes that actually happen in languages over time. And there are so much more subdivisions and just different kinds of sound changes, but I'm not going to talk about them. And when we actually meet them, I'll just explain them separately. Firstly, assimilation is when two or more sounds become similar to each other. So when you pronounce disgusting, you pronounce the J's if it were K or a C. So you don't say disgusting, but you say disgusting. Well, this is because the preceding sound, S, is a voiceless sound, whereas the following sound, J, is a voiced sound. So one of them assimilated to the other. And since, in this case, the following sound assimilated to the preceding sound, it's called a lag assimilation. The opposite happened in Italian, where for the same consonant cluster, SG, an anticipatory assimilation happened where S assimilated to G so that it becomes sguardo. Also note that these are all examples of allophony, and I'll explain allophony later on, so just keep that in mind. Desimilation is the opposite of assimilation when two or more sounds become more distinct. So the most popular example would be the R deletion in some American dialects. So when you say the word governor, you don't really say governor. You don't really pronounce both the R's, but you just say governor. And this is because, well, it is harder to pronounce the R sound twice in a relatively short length of time. So one of the R's just dissimilates. Whereas when you pronounce the word government, you do pronounce the R, although it's the same R because there is no R sound following it, so there's no reason for dissimilation. Lenition. Lenition is a weakening of a sound. So, for example, most famous one would be one that happened from Old Japanese to modern Japanese. So the Old Japanese word for human, pita, the p sound at the beginning of the word weakened to f, so it became fito. Then it weakened even more and became just an H sound, which is called the glottal fricative, so it became hito. And actually, when a sound weakens to a glottal fricative, it has a separate word, which is debuccalization. And the reason why this is called separately is because when it changes to the H sound, it means that the sound loses its position of articulation. Usually, when lenition happens, this is how the chain of lenition looks like. So plosive becomes fricative, then the fricative disappears, or the plosive becomes approximant and it disappears. Fortition is, well, strengthening of a sound. So it's the opposite of lenition. The most famous one would be Latin palatal approximant strengthening in different ways, and I actually wrote that it becomes post-alveolar affricate, but that's only in Italian. So for example, the Latin word jocus, in Spanish, the first y sound became h via the fricative, so it becomes juego. In Portuguese and French, it's the same sound strengthens to j post-alveolar fricative. So in Portuguese, it becomes jogo, and in French, it becomes je. Also note that the C becomes G in Spanish and Portuguese, and it completely disappears in French. Well, this is another example of lenition. Epemphasis is when you add a sound. So like when some people pronounce hamster as hamster with a P sound added between. Or when a Latin word starting with S and a consonant becomes ES consonant. So like when the Latin word studio, I study, becomes estudiar in Spanish, estudar in Portuguese, and étudier in French. Also note that in French, the S disappeared. So the reason why the S disappeared in French is because elision happened. And elision is a deletion of a sound. So an example would be the S disappearing from Middle French étudier to modern French étudier. And epemphasis, depending on where it happens, could be prophecies or epiphysis. Elision could be apocope, syncope, apheresis. There's so many different names, but you don't have to know them. Metaphysis is a very funny one because it's when two or more sounds change places. Like when some dialects of English, you pronounce ask as ox, or the Latin word for miracle, miraculum, becomes milagro in Spanish. So you can see that in Latin, R comes first, then L, but in Spanish, L comes first, then R. There's also something called quantitative metathesis, as opposed to qualitative, which we've just looked at. And instead of actually explaining, which would be very complicated, I'll just show you an example, which you will be looking at if you follow the classical Greek course as well. So the first one is Homeric Greek. It's a version of Greek used around BC 800. The second one is about 400 years after that. So the first word is boleos. So pay attention to the last two vowels, the e and the o. So in the Homeric Greek, the e is a longer one, the o is a short one. However, in the Attic Greek, 400 years after, well, the vowels stay in the same positions, but the length changes position. So it becomes boleos. Now the E is short and the O is long, and this is why it's called quantitative. It refers to the quantity of the vowel instead of the quality. An allophone is very important when you're interested in phonology. It's when a phoneme is pronounced differently in some cases. And what's important about an allophone is that even though they are different sounds, technically the native speakers would still consider as the same phoneme. Like when in American English you say water, you say water, the T becomes R and an alveolar tap. But any English speakers would still consider it to be a T. Compensatory lengthening, this is actually the last one we are going to look at today. So it's quite complicated. So I've prepared 3 different examples, which all happened in ancient Greek. So to summarize it, it's when a sound is lengthened to compensate something. So the first example, it's a word get on, which means an old man. In the proto-language, it was gerons. The O was followed by NTS. But then in the classical Greek, it's only followed by N. And also note that in the first part, in the proto-language, the O is short, but in the daughter language, the O is long. So the O was lengthened to compensate the deletion of the TS, hence the name compensatory. Another example is the word all or every, entire, which is bars. So it used to be buns. But the N and T disappeared, and in order to compensate that, the A was lengthened. The last example is a feminine present participle of the copular verb. You don't have to understand what that means. But again, you see onsa became orsa as the N and T disappeared, the O was lengthened, and through regular sound change rules, the long O became U, hence we get the classical Greek usa. And that's it for today. So in the next lesson of comparative linguistics, we are going to look at nominal morphology, which is how nouns behave in different languages. And actually, next week, instead of comparative linguistics, there will be a classical Greek introduction. And the reason why the order is mixed is because actually every comparative linguistic lesson is followed by a classical Greek lesson that actually applies the knowledge that you've learned from it. So when you learn the nominal morphology in the next month, then the lesson following that would be how nouns behave in classical Greek and how it developed. Anyway, that was it for today, and please leave a comment if you have any questions, and please subscribe to the channel. It's a brilliant channel, and I will see you in the next lesson.